All right, let's elaborate a bit on that saltwater flooding, because with the coastal alerts that we have, coastal flood warnings, coastal flood advisories extend all the way to coastal Alabama. Galveston resident and extreme weather scientist Hal Needham, he shared some of these videos with us of street flooding. This is that saltwater flooding. Yes, we had some rain in Galveston, but it was that push of salt water, which is bad for
Do not drive your car through salt water. It's going to eat right through. It's so corrosive on the wires, everything.
There was a little bit of freshwater flooding, too. Hal actually joins us now. Hal, I love the nickname. He also goes by Hurricane Hal. I've been told that you're standing in some water. Has it overall subsided? And tell us, is it fresh water? Is it salt water? What are you dealing with? I see the blue skies.
As you can see, it's sunny here. We have saltwater flooding here. This is all saltwater I'm standing in. It's slowly coming down, but this is the third day that we've had big-time saltwater floods here on Galveston Island.
You have decades of experience. Your thoughts on this this storm? Were you surprised by the amount of surge that Galveston Island experienced? I mean, we could talk about San Luis Pass all the way up into Jamaica Beach. I mean, down even into Brazoria County, too, Surfside. It was incredible, some of these images that we saw as Alberto was just beginning to organize.
Well, you know, props to the National Hurricane Center and the slosh model. This was very well forecast. In fact, going into this storm, more storm surge was forecast along the upper Texas coast than places like South Padre Island, a lot closer to the center of circulation. That's because we have such shallow water here along the upper Texas coast. It didn't fool the models. It did not fool the experts, but I think it fooled a lot of people that were looking at the cone of uncertainty, the center of circulation, and saying, how in the world is this going to flood Galveston, Texas, hundreds of miles north of the center of circulation?
Is there something that you could compare it to, Hal, what you've seen in Galveston? I mean, Galveston is home for you, correct? And thinking a storm of reference. I mean, we're not talking about huge impacts. And the contrast is what's so wild to me, how you have sun shining on your face this morning, and you're still dealing with some saltwater flooding.
You know, as far as the saltwater flood levels, we get a lot of that up here. So the flood levels themselves didn't really stand out or surprise people. But I think what really shocked people, this was not a landfalling hurricane close to home here. This storm is going to make landfall. You know, like you said, it just made landfall in Mexico. So I think the surprise to a lot of people was seeing a storm with a wind field that huge, able to push storm surge all the way from, you know, getting farther south in the Gulf of Mexico. I think a lot of people were surprised that the storm had the ability to do that.
As a resident in Galveston, what have been the sights that you've seen? Did people, I'm mainly talking about their cars, because a lot of these homes, you know, built on, they're elevated. Some homes aren't, but was a lot of property able to get removed ahead of this flooding, or maybe during the flooding as people were having to drive through that salt water?
Yeah, we have a lot of elevated homes here. A few homes actually did flood, but most of the homes were above. It's more of an issue with vehicles, and a lot of people parking their vehicles maybe several blocks away from where they live and walking through the salt water. We saw that. We also saw the beach patrol take all the lifeguard stands off the beach in the days before the storm. So really preparing for things like that on the lower ground, getting your vehicle to higher ground. And a lot of people were elevating things in their garage or on their first floor just to make sure that they're up above the saltwater levels.
We've had reports, too, portions of Highway 87 were closed off. I mean, have you ventured out on the roads? Are there some trouble spots that you guys are dealing with on Galveston Island even this morning?
Yeah, you know, this morning downtown by the Strand had some high water. I'm over by Hertz Lane. This is a very flood-prone area. And some of these Bayside communities over by Jamaica Beach and on the west end of Galveston, as well as Bolivar Peninsula across the bay. You mentioned Highway 87 over there in Bolivar Peninsula. That's very flood-prone. They actually shut down the ferry that connects Galveston with Bolivar, so I was not able to go over there. But I would expect with the really high waves, the wave run-up on the beach, I would expect some water was definitely going over Highway 87 in Bolivar Peninsula as well.
Bob Van Dillen also brought up a great point regarding the astronomical tide. We are working with that tide. I think it's approaching. Is there an idea? Will we probably see some of this recede by this afternoon? I mean, we're still working toward that high tide cycle. I believe it's imminent, any minute.
Yeah, here on the island, our high tide was around dawn this morning, but like you had mentioned before, it's still working in the Galveston Bay, some Galveston Bay communities, the tide's still coming up. We noticed today on the tide gauge, the predicted high tide was 1 inch higher than yesterday as we get closer to that that full moon. And what was really interesting to me is to see how much every inch counts. Yesterday morning, I saw the water level. I came back in the afternoon, it was 2 inches higher.
Wow.
There were entire streets that flooded that were dry in the morning and wet in the afternoon because of 2 inches rise in the tides. So that's how flat these areas are. Entire streets flooded from a 2-inch rise in salt water. So when you're in low-lying areas like that, you really have to, every inch counts and every inch really matters.
And I think it's a good mental note, too. Our forecasting only as good as our tools. And so we know, okay, Alberto may be a bit of an overperformer when we were talking and looking at that flooding and that tide cycle and what it did inland, farther inland, something to consider, and always great to get your perspective. Galveston resident and extreme weather scientist, Hurricane Hal Needham, thanks for being with us this morning on Weather Command.
Thanks so much. Stay safe, everybody.
All right. Yeah, good to see you, Hal. The